I didn't want to make a commentary video, but clearly the events of the past week have spurred a lot of people to action. The invasion of Ukraine by Russian armed forces is obviously a horrible, dastardly deed, a violation of international law, and just a complete shock to the norms, sensibilities of the decent people of much of the world. In fact, what is stunning is not that it was merely that it's so terrible, but that it just seems so anachronistic. In many respects, it mirrors a lot of horrible invasions of the last century or so, because in many ways they also hearken to a different time. The reason I picked the quote above is because clearly this was not merely a horrible crime, but truly a blunder. Vladimir Putin could have literally gotten almost everything that he wanted in the simple negotiations that were offered to him. The negotiation table was constantly offered to him. Even the Ukrainian president, before hostilities began, offered to sit down. In fact, as the tanks were rolling, as the missiles were being hurled and the planes were in the air attacking his country, President Zelensky actually pled with the Russian people to stop the war. So there was not bellicosity there. It was a completely unbelievably unprovoked attack. And the reason why it's a horrendous blunder is because, again, this was something that could have completely been avoided. And instead, the ambitions of one man, the machinations of one man, the president of the Russian Federation, Mr. Putin, trumped everything else. Now, a lot of people are going to question what were the motives for Mr. Putin. Was it because he wanted to expand his power? Was it because he wanted to distract attention from domestic problems? Was it because he wanted to show the rest of the world who's boss, flex his muscles? Well, we can get into a whole myriad of possible motives, psychological motives, what's in the mind of the president of the Russian Federation. But the reality is, at the end of the day, this was a behavior that was just without any cause or justification. And you can see that the exhaustion of peace negotiations, the exhaustion of the attempt to hand the olive branch over was absolutely essential. Because if nothing else, allies around the world, and of course specifically the Ukrainian government, cannot be accused of trying in any way to provoke the hostilities that have taken place. Now, what is absolutely unprecedented, if not indeed, at least in scope, is the level of international reaction. The boycotting, the divesting, the sheer massive ostracism of the Russian leadership, the Russian oligarchs that support President Putin, and of course, everybody down the line, right down to cutting off the banking for the Russian interest. This is stunning because, again, there have been precedents. What comes to mind is the ostracism of the apartheid-era South African regime in the 1970s and 80s and early 90s. But this is on a scale that is completely much bigger and faster than anything we've seen at that time. We truly are coming into an era when behavior well beyond the norm and beyond what most people consider to be decency is going to be condemned with fiercer force. And yes, even the United States, when it invaded Iraq, clearly was ostracized by a sizable portion of the international community. Not to the degree that Russia's invasion was. And I think there are different circumstances. And we have to be careful not to compare them a little too closely. After all, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was conducted in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And obviously, Ukraine had done nothing of that sort to Russia. Nevertheless, the negative reaction to the American invasion tells us something, that we're getting to a point in our history where invasions of even quote unquote breakaway parts of the old empire, of the old government, are not considered to be acceptable human behavior. Of course, I kind of wonder if the banning of the Russian football soccer team from FIFA is going to be more noticed by people than many of the other acts taken against the Russian Federation and its people. And while he may very well be among the list of some of the worst leaders in history, the reality is we have to be careful to compare him to the worst of the worst. People, of course, now are comparing him very much to Adolf Hitler. And while that seems to be a knee-jerk comparison a lot of people make, we should be very careful. When we're talking about Hitler and the Nazi genocide and the Nazi violations of international law when dealing with prisoners of war, conquered people, we are really talking about the foulest known violations that we have in our modern history. Now, having said that, Putin could definitely still be argued to be a Hitlerian figure, meaning that his scale of killing, his scale of savage warfare, is very much akin to the way Hitler conducted his own campaigns in World War II, the way that he wanted German armed forces to behave. It's well known that when Germans occupied territories, that they were not simply satisfied to execute the occasional saboteur or the occasional resistance person, but they engaged in shocking violations against civilians, where they didn't hesitate to kill, as a policy, 10 civilians for every one of their own soldiers killed. That was well documented. The use of weapons against civilian targets on a mass scale. Right down to near the end of the war when rockets were fired over cities like London, when that was militarily not necessary. Just shows the level of depravity. And as we can see now in the war in Ukraine, it seems not too dissimilar. Not achieving the military objectives, Putin seems to be pushing the generals to go toward the savage techniques, hoping that since the regular military objectives are not being achieved, it's time to just terrify and cow the population into submission. Again, I think that in the long run this is a mistake. This is just going to create more outrage, and clearly it's creating more fury, not just in Ukraine but around the world. But that makes sense in a way, because that's the go-to for dictators or authoritarian leaders. They feel that because they have attained power, not through the niceties of things like democracy and legal procedures, or they manage to find the loopholes, legal procedures, that they can do what they want. They feel that that's their advantage. And the other huge comparison, the other huge similarity that I have to note, why I would say that Putin is a Hitlerian figure, is because of his characteristic hubris. And when I say hubris, I mean his overweening overconfidence in his own abilities. His attitude that he is clearly a superior man, destined for a greatness that is beyond even the average, even beyond average greatness. But that conversely extends not merely to his overestimation of himself, but his just sheer contempt for his counterparts in other countries. I mean, we can go into the horrors of his actions, but just see what he did just before this invasion. He had the president of France the German Chancellor, a lot of other people come and visit him, talk about peace. He made a big show of not really wanting to war, but that being kind of pushed into it. And even though the President of the United States, for example, and other figures tried to offer a desperate attempt to get him to negotiate and to basically offer almost to accede to almost most of his demands, and some people would argue to appease him, nevertheless, he did not hesitate to pull the trigger and go to war. Cannot help but notice the comparisons to Hitler in that sense. When Hitler met with the Western leaders in Munich before his takeover of then Czechoslovakia, he commented in private that he saw the leaders in the West and he judged them to be worms. He had complete contempt for them. He thought that their reliance on laws and norms and decency and their unwillingness to run to a fight showed their absolute weakness. You cannot help but notice that with Putin there's a gross similarity. He is someone who thinks that if you are afraid to fight, you must be not merely a coward, but the lowest form of life, and you are deserving of being conquered and deserving of having everything taken away from you. He doesn't realize that civilized people don't run into a fight because that is not the normal mode of engagement. That whenever possible, you negotiate, and the military option should always be a last resort. Now, I've been looking at the domestic response to a lot of the actions by our government, specifically as directed by President Biden. And while there has been some clearly positive reaction, I see a lot of negative sentiments. Arguments that we look weak because we're not intervening militarily, or that this would never have happened had President Trump been in office. And I think I should address that a little bit. First of all, while it's true that sanctions and policies and things to do with banking and regulations and divestiture and all these things might just get people's eyes to glaze over, and they may not have the same direct visceral impact that it might be to send troops into a foreign country. The reality is that would be the worst possible policy if we did that. To get involved in a non-NATO country in the middle of Europe, thousands of miles away, could literally start the Third World War. That might sound like an exaggeration, but you have to wonder if someone like Putin is willing to use the most horrible tactics to try to cow the Ukrainians into submission. Do you think that an act of really aggression on that level by American armed forces would be the right course? It would just get us involved again in another foreign campaign. And that would just be the most optimistic evaluation. That would be the most optimistic, just to have a few thousand casualties, to be another Iraq. That would be the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is flat out that, a global conflict where Russia might plead with other allies to help it in an hour of need, where American incursion into a country like Ukraine would be seen not merely as a defense of the Ukrainian people, but as a possible invasion, as part of some kind of wicked plot. That's the last thing we need to do. We do need to be supportive, and of course, we do need to give every kind of supply that we can, and even if that includes lethal aid, then we must do that. If missiles, helicopters, planes are necessary to help the Ukrainian people defend themselves, then we got to go forward. And in that sense, and if the economic If the economic response is what's going to take, it's going to take. It's not going to be a hot, sexy situation. It's going to take time. It's going to be frustrating. But you can already see the impact in Russia. People are starting to get this very strongly. Now, regarding the argument that none of this would happen had President Trump been in office, I'll give the devil its due on two counts. Yes, number one, technically, Putin had not invaded another country on the scale that he has done now. That is true. Although, when you look at the Russian attacks in Syria, the tactics that used by the Russians there have been widely condemned by a lot of people. Civilians were slaughtered, buildings were bombed indiscriminately. It was really warfare of the most savage type. And Trump, of course, did not make any condemnation. Now, the second thing that I would definitely give the devil his due is that the Trump administration did send missiles, lethal aid, to Ukraine in his administration. There's something you have to fault the Obama administration. It was that it only gave Ukrainians non-lethal aid. Whether one likes it or not, if one is going to have true deterrence, you're going to deter an aggressive foe, you need to supply those people who can be invaded with strong weapons to defend themselves. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that Biden actually continued delivering those weapons. Even last year, well before this invasion took place. Probably to some degree in anticipation of this invasion. But what is interesting, of course, is many people like to see the Biden administration as diametrically opposite of Trump's. But the reality is that on many different issues, Biden has actually continued some of the Trump policies. Now, of course, Trump people will champion that and crow that that's proof of the validity of those policies. But what I would also argue is that sometimes that shows a statesman-like sense of things. That, of course, you can't always throw out the baby with the bathwater. And that even an administration that has done some terrible things, which I believe the Trump administration has done, there are still things of merit. And in fact, the objectivity of the Biden administration in keeping those policies that it felt were value to the interests of the United States says a lot. Because Biden could have just gone sheer partisan and just simply continued the Obama course of not providing lethal aid. Instead, this has helped the Ukrainians to at least have a fighting chance. My very simple assessment of this war regarding the Ukrainians is the most important objective they need, besides victory itself, is time. If they can extend the clock, they can extend this war to a couple of weeks, this could really be game over. That, as much as anything else, could lead to victory. While it's true that inflicting casualties on the enemy, winning skirmishes and battles would be very valuable, not surrendering, all those things are very powerful. The most critical, most pragmatic thing Ukrainians can do is keep fighting. The longer they fight, the more time there is for them to keep defenses, for weapons and supplies to be brought to them, and the longer it lasts, the more that Russian society will stagger. One of the reasons that Putin is probably re-intensifying his efforts is because he realizes that. He realizes that as the war drags on, as billions of, in his case, rubles, or nearly worthless rubles, have to be expended, there's going to be a point where this is going to cost more blood and treasure than even he can muster. That, basically, in a nutshell, is the most important thing. aside from victory itself. Just keep fighting until the other side realizes this is not going to happen. And we can see that the longer this is going on, the worse this is getting. Now, I'll be one of those people to go out on a limb and say that I do not necessarily see a complete realignment of the political world. I do not see nuclear Armageddon on the horizon and a lot of other things that people are saying. I think quite the opposite, and call me naive, but I actually think that this is a confirmation of a lot of the world order. This is proof that a lot of our systems are actually stronger than many adversaries would think. It is interesting that up until very recently, even just the last few years, I've been reading a lot of articles in foreign policy journals and periodicals that have claimed that democracy is in its waning days and that authoritarianism is the way to go. And the fact that we saw that a little bit in the United States or other countries is proof positive that the days of, strong liberal democracies and respect for precedents and rule of law are going to go by the wayside. It is very interesting that a small democratic country of 40-some million people is resisting successfully the military might of a country of over 140 million people. Let that sink in. Now, the last things I want to say is, number one, obviously people are going to talk about the possible end of the Putin regime. One caution I just want to say to anybody is, while we can get in our heads that it might be a great idea to engage in some type of action to directly remove President Putin from power, the reality is, at the end of the day, the only people who should be tasked with the duty of removing President Putin from power has to be the Russian people. Preferably in a legal scenario, but at the end of the day, it has to be up to the Russian people. Now, one could say their hands are tied. They're in a cruel, tough, authoritarian security state that's got eyes and guns on them and so forth. But the reality is, if outside forces try directly to remove President Putin in some type of a regime change, the reality is, what is that going to do? All that is going to do is to foster the arguments that the removal of President Putin is basically a foreign plot. We need to avoid that at all costs. And the last thing I want to put in, and it's a very important message, and I actually have to give credit to the comedian Bill Maher for this, is when this war eventually is over, and the realities, the post-war reality of this takes place, while blame, culpability, responsibility, obviously criminal charges and so forth will be assigned, we must, as a collective world, especially the West, make a concerted effort to reintegrate Russia into the family of nations. Now, that might sound like a strange thing to say right now in the midst of a horrible war that was, of course, carried out by the Russians. But this, we cannot emphasize this enough, because the truth is, merely punishing, merely condemning, merely ostracizing a country like Russia is only going to lead them down an angry and bitter and negative path. The truth is, Russians have contributed some of the greatest cultural, scientific, philosophic, just greatest overall contributions in human history. In fact, what is very, of course, is revered in Russian history, of course, the Great Patriotic War, even though it happened during the Soviet Union. Just that, the key factor in defeating the Nazis. That alone is their contribution to the world. We have to be careful. Now, that doesn't mean that a weakened Russia will succumb to another dictator or something like that on the level of a Putin, let alone a czar or something like that. But still, even if Russia were to just become a third tier or fourth tier power, the danger is that it could just become another country like Iran, a country that will resort to things like terrorism or just complete gross and constant violations of international law. What is so heartening, among other things that we've seen this week, is seeing people in Russia getting out there and protesting, even though the consequences for protesting in Russia are very, very severe. People are being jailed right now in Russia because they dare to criticize the war and criticize the regime. And in that way, they show themselves to be among the good people of the world. We cannot forget those people. And if we need a positive example, a concrete example of what we can do, all we have to do is see what happened to Germany and Japan, especially West Germany after World War II. Considering the crimes of the Nazi regime, considering the crimes of Imperial Japan, the fact that these two nations, completely defeated and devastated, were rebuilt, supported, protected by the Allies, specifically the United States, but all the Allies, and brought back into the family of nations to become peaceful, prosperous, non-threatening, valuable leaders in the global community. That is proof that what we can do with Russia is not merely a naive hope. Sorry if this video went on a little long, but I felt that a lot of these points had to be brought out. I thank you all for listening, and I wish you well.
Not fair. I yelled dibbies on the bed.
True. But then I pointed out that I am bigger than you are.
It still doesn't make it right.
If you are big enough to get away with it, it's right. That's international law.